May 2019, The Tonight Show stage, New York City. 3.2 million viewers watching live as Tom Hanks shares stories from his latest film. The audience is laughing, the energy is perfect, everything is going smoothly. Then suddenly, a disheveled man bursts through the studio doors screaming Tom's name. Security rushes toward him, the cameras keep rolling. And what Tom Hanks did in the next 60 seconds didn't just stop the show, it stopped the entire nation from changing the channel. He made a decision that broke every rule of live television, revealed the man behind the movie star, and proved that sometimes the most important performances happen when the cameras accidentally capture who we really are. If you're ready to witness the moment Tom Hanks chose humanity over Hollywood, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because this story will show you what true compassion looks like under the brightest spotlight imaginable. Let's dive into the night that changed everything. His name was Robert Mitchell, and 20 years ago, he was everything society tells us to admire. A PhD in English literature from Columbia University. A beloved teacher at one of Manhattan's most prestigious private schools. A published author with 2 critically acclaimed books about American poetry. A husband. A father. A man who seemed to have it all figured out. Robert's life was the American dream made real. He lived in a comfortable brownstone in Brooklyn with his wife Sarah and their 2 daughters, Emma and Claire. Every morning, he would take the subway to the Dalton School on the Upper East Side, where he taught advanced placement literature to some of the brightest students in New York City. Professor Mitchell was the kind of teacher who changed lives, recalled Jennifer Adams, one of his former students who later became a journalist. He didn't just teach us about books. He taught us how literature could help us understand ourselves and the world. He made us believe that words had the power to heal. But Robert had a secret that he hid from everyone in his carefully constructed life. He was struggling with severe depression and anxiety, conditions that ran deep in his family but that he had always been too proud to acknowledge or treat. In the late 1990s, mental health was still stigmatized, especially for men in professional positions. Robert convinced himself that admitting he needed help would be a sign of weakness. The cracks began to show in 2001. The pressure of maintaining perfection, the weight of unaddressed mental illness, and a series of personal losses began to overwhelm Robert. His father died suddenly from a heart attack. One of his favorite students committed suicide, and the voices in his head that had always whispered doubts began to scream. Robert started missing classes. His usually meticulous lesson plans became scattered and incoherent. He would stand in front of his students and lose his train of thought mid-sentence, staring at them with confusion and fear. The school administration noticed the changes and suggested he take a leave of absence to rest and recover. But taking time off only made things worse. Without the structure of work, Robert's depression spiraled out of control. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating regularly. He would spend entire days in his study, reading the same pages over and over, without comprehending a single word. His wife Sarah tried everything to help him. She scheduled appointments with therapists, which Robert would cancel at the last minute. She researched medications and support groups. She begged him to talk to her about what he was feeling. But Robert had retreated so far into himself that he couldn't reach back out, even to the people who loved him most. "I watched my husband disappear piece by piece," Sarah later told a documentary filmmaker. "The man I married was kind, brilliant, and full of life. But the depression was like a thief that stole him from us slowly, until I was living with a stranger who looked like Robert but wasn't him anymore." The breaking point came in December 2002. Robert's school informed him that they couldn't hold his position any longer. Without his teaching salary, the family struggled financially. Medical bills for therapy sessions and medications that Robert refused to take consistently piled up. The brownstone they loved was suddenly unaffordable. Sarah took a second job to try to keep the family afloat, but it wasn't enough. Robert, consumed by shame and guilt over his inability to provide for his family, made a decision that would destroy everything. Without telling anyone, he withdrew the last of their savings, money they had been setting aside for their daughter's college education, and disappeared. He left a note that simply said, "You'll all be better off without me. I'm sorry I couldn't be the man you needed me to be." Robert Mitchell, PhD, published author, beloved teacher, vanished into the vast anonymity of New York City's homeless population. And for the next 17 years, his family had no idea if he was alive or dead. Living on the streets of New York City is a special kind of hell that few people who haven't experienced it can truly understand. Robert Mitchell learned this truth within his first week of homelessness. The man who had once commanded respect in prestigious classrooms was now invisible, just another face in the endless parade of forgotten people that most New Yorkers trained themselves not to see. Robert's descent was rapid and brutal. Without medication for his depression and anxiety, his mental state deteriorated quickly. The voices that had whispered doubts now screamed accusations. He would have conversations with people who weren't there. He would forget where he was or what year it was. Time became fluid and meaningless. He slept in subway stations during the winter, learning which platforms the police rarely patrolled. In the summer, he found spots in Central Park where the bushes were thick enough to provide shelter. He ate from garbage cans behind restaurants, learned which soup kitchens served meals on which days, and discovered that the public library was the best place to escape the cold without being immediately kicked out. But the physical hardship wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the invisibility. People would look through him as if he didn't exist. Parents would pull their children away when he walked past. Business owners would shoo him away from their storefronts. He had become less than human in the eyes of society, just a problem to be avoided or removed. Yet somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of mental illness and trauma and shame, a part of Robert Mitchell still existed. That part remembered who he had been. That part remembered his daughters' faces, even as the details became increasingly fuzzy. That part remembered the joy of teaching, of watching students' eyes light up when they understood a complex piece of literature. And that part remembered Tom Hanks. In 2000, during one of his good periods before everything fell apart, Robert had assigned his AP literature class a unique project. They were studying narrative structure and character development, and Robert had decided to use films as a teaching tool alongside traditional literature. One of the films he chose was Forrest Gump. Robert had seen it when it first came out in 1994, but hadn't fully appreciated its literary merit until he watched it again with a teacher's analytical eye. The film's narrative structure, its use of historical events as backdrop for personal growth, the way it explored themes of fate versus free will, it was all brilliant. But what really struck Robert was Tom Hanks's performance, the way he brought such humanity to a character that could have easily been a caricature, the way he made Forrest's simple worldview feel profound rather than simplistic, the way he showed that kindness and persistence could be their own form of intelligence. Robert showed the film to his class and led discussions that dove deep into its themes. His students wrote essays comparing Forrest's journey to classic literary heroes. They analyzed the screenplay's structure and debated whether the film was optimistic or tragic in its worldview. But for Robert personally, the film became something more. Forrest's famous line, "I'm not a smart man, but I know what love is," hit him in a way he didn't expect. Here was a character who faced incredible challenges, but never lost his fundamental decency. A character who persisted through pain and confusion and loss, and somehow came out the other side still believing in goodness. Robert wished he could be like Forrest. He wished he had that kind of resilience, that kind of unshakable faith that things would work out. But he didn't. And when his own life fell apart, he thought constantly about that contrast. Forrest could survive anything. Robert couldn't even survive his own mind. On the streets, Robert would sometimes whisper lines from the film to himself like prayers. Life is like a box of chocolates. Stupid is as stupid does. I just felt like running. The words were a lifeline to his former self, proof that he had once been a man who taught students about art and meaning and hope. Years passed. Robert's appearance changed dramatically. His hair grew long and matted. His beard became wild and unkempt. His clothes, donated from shelters and salvaged from trash bins, hung loose on his malnourished frame. The distinguished professor had disappeared completely, replaced by someone who looked decades older than his actual age. But through it all, through the worst moments of confusion and despair, through winters so cold he wasn't sure he'd survive and summers so hot he could barely breathe, one thought kept recurring. A thought that seemed crazy even to his fractured mind, but that wouldn't leave him alone. He needed to find Tom Hanks. He needed to tell him something. He needed to explain how Forrest Gump had been both a comfort and a torment, how the film had shown him what resilience looked like right before he lost all his own, how he had failed to live up to the lessons he had taught his students using that very movie. Robert knew it was irrational. He knew Tom Hanks was a movie star who lived in a different world, unreachable to someone like him. He knew that even if by some miracle he could find him, security would never let a homeless man anywhere near him. But the thought persisted, growing stronger over the years until it became an obsession. Find Tom Hanks. Tell him the truth. Maybe then the noise in his head would finally quiet down. Maybe then he could find some kind of peace. In May 2019, Robert was sleeping on a grate outside a closed electronics store in Midtown Manhattan when he saw it. Through the window, on a display television that someone had left on, Tom Hanks was being interviewed on The Tonight Show. The store was closed, but the TV was broadcasting to the empty street. Robert pressed his face against the glass, staring at the screen. Tom looked older than he did in Forrest Gump, but he still had that same warm smile, that same genuine quality that had made Robert assign the film to his students all those years ago. Jimmy Fallon was laughing at something Tom said. The audience was applauding, and something clicked in Robert's damaged mind. The Tonight Show was filmed in New York City, at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, only a few blocks from where he was standing. Tom Hanks was here, right now, less than a mile away. The rational part of Robert's mind tried to argue that this didn't matter, that there was no way he could get into the studio, that this was just another symptom of his mental illness creating impossible missions to distract from his hopeless reality. But the irrational part, the part that had been growing stronger over 17 years on the streets, was louder. This was fate. This was meant to happen. After all these years, all this suffering, he finally had a chance to deliver the message that had been burning inside him. Robert Mitchell stood up from his makeshift bed, gathered his few possessions into a torn backpack, and started walking toward 30 Rock. He had no plan, no strategy, no idea what he would say if he somehow made it inside. He just knew he had to try. Because after 17 years of being invisible, he needed someone to see him. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to himself, he believed that Tom Hanks would. What happened next would shock millions of viewers and prove that sometimes the universe conspires to create moments of grace in the most unexpected circumstances. May 14th, 2019, 11:47 p.m., The Tonight Show. Starring Jimmy Fallon was in its final segment. Tom Hanks, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, was sitting in the guest chair sharing a hilarious story about a mishap during the filming of his latest project, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. The studio audience of 240 people was laughing and engaged. The energy was perfect. Jimmy Fallon was doing what he did best, being an enthusiastic fan while keeping the conversation flowing naturally. Cameras captured every moment for the 3.2 million viewers watching live across the country. Behind the scenes, the production was running like a well-oiled machine. Director Dave Diomede was calling shots from the control room. Stage managers were preparing for the final commercial break. Security guards were stationed at all the studio entrances, a standard protocol for any taping. But then, at 11:49 p.m., something happened that no amount of planning could have prevented. A side entrance to the studio, a door that led to a service corridor used by staff, suddenly burst open. The security guard who should have been stationed there had stepped away for just 30 seconds to use the restroom. That 30-second window was all it took. Robert Mitchell stumbled into the studio, his wild appearance and disheveled clothes immediately apparent to everyone in the audience. For a moment, there was confusion. Was this part of the show? Some kind of sketch? But then Robert started shouting, his voice raw and desperate. Tom Hanks, I need to talk to you. Please, I need to tell you something." The audience gasped. Security immediately moved toward the intruder. Jimmy Fallon froze, unsure whether to cut to commercial or address what was happening. In the control room, Director Diomede made a split-second decision to keep cameras rolling. If this was a genuine security threat, the footage would be important for police. Everything happened in seconds, but to everyone present, time seemed to slow down dramatically. 2 security guards reached Robert and grabbed his arms. He struggled against them, not violently but desperately, still calling out to Tom, "Please, I was a teacher. I taught your movie. I just need 1 minute. This was the moment where standard protocol was clear. Remove the intruder immediately, secure the area, evacuate the celebrity if necessary, apologize to the audience, cut to commercial. Every person on the production team knew exactly what should happen next. But Tom Hanks didn't follow the script. Instead of standing up and being ushered to safety, Tom held up his hand toward security. It was a simple gesture, but it carried unmistakable authority. The guards paused, confused but trained to respect the wishes of talent when it didn't compromise safety. "Wait," Tom said, his voice calm but firm. The microphone picked up every word, broadcasting it to millions. "Just wait a second." Tom stood up slowly and walked toward Robert. The audience was completely silent now, tension thick in the air. Jimmy Fallon remained in his seat, as shocked as everyone else by what was unfolding. Tom approached until he was standing directly in front of Robert, looking into the eyes of this homeless man who had crashed his interview. What he saw there made him make a decision that would define this moment. "Sir, what's your name?" Tom asked gently. Robert, still held by security guards but no longer struggling, stared at Tom with an expression of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. "Robert," he managed to say, his voice breaking. "Robert Mitchell. I was a teacher." "Okay, Robert," Tom said, then turned to security. "Can you let him go, please? He's not going to hurt anyone. Are you, Robert?" Robert shook his head vigorously, tears starting to stream down his weathered face. The security guards looked to the director, who gave a hesitant nod. They released Robert but stayed close, ready to intervene if needed. Tom then did something that made the entire studio gasp. He gestured toward Jimmy Fallon's guest chair. "Robert, would you like to sit down? You said you needed to tell me something. I'm listening." The control room erupted in chaos. "What is he doing?" someone shouted. "We need to cut to commercial." But Director Diomede, recognizing that something extraordinary was happening, made the call. "Keep rolling. All cameras on them." Robert, trembling and clearly overwhelmed, allowed Tom to guide him to the chair. Tom pulled up another chair and sat directly across from him, giving Robert his complete attention. The cameras captured everything. "Take your time," Tom said softly. "What did you want to tell me?" Robert tried to speak, but emotion overwhelmed him. He put his face in his hands and sobbed, deep, wrenching sobs that came from 17 years of stored pain and shame and loneliness. The audience watched in stunned silence as this broken man cried in front of millions of people. Tom didn't rush him. He simply sat there, patient and present, occasionally saying, "It's okay. Take your time. You're safe here." Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was only about 90 seconds, Robert looked up. When he spoke, his voice was clearer, as if the crying had washed away some of the confusion that usually clouded his mind. 20 years ago, I was Dr. Robert Mitchell. I taught AP Literature at the Dalton School in Manhattan. I had a wife, 2 daughters, a career I loved. I was somebody." Tom nodded, encouraging him to continue. "In 2000, I taught a unit using Forrest Gump. Your performance in that film, it was brilliant. I used it to teach my students about character development, about resilience, about what it means to persist through difficulty with grace and kindness." Robert paused, struggling with what to say next. "But then I got sick. Depression. Anxiety. I couldn't admit I needed help. I lost everything. My job, my home, my family. And I've been on the streets for 17 years. The audience was crying now. Even the camera operators were wiping their eyes. This was no longer entertainment. This was raw human truth being broadcast live. "I kept thinking about Forrest," Robert continued, "how he faced every challenge and never lost who he was. And I realized I had taught my students about resilience using your character. But when it was my turn to be resilient, I failed completely. I ran away. I disappeared. I became this." He gestured to his ragged clothes and matted hair with shame. "So, I needed to tell you," Robert said, his voice gaining strength, "that your work mattered, that it taught people important things, and that even though I failed to live up to those lessons, they were real and true. And I'm sorry I wasted the gift of your art by throwing my life away. The studio was absolutely silent. 3.2 million people at home weren't changing the channel. They were frozen, witnessing something they had never seen on television before. Tom Hanks, one of the most famous actors in the world, sat looking at this homeless man with an expression of deep compassion and pain. When he finally spoke, his words would become one of the most replayed moments in late-night television history. "Robert," Tom said, his own voice thick with emotion, "you didn't fail. You're still here. And the fact that you're sitting in this chair right now, telling your story, proves that you're stronger than you think you are." What Tom Hanks said next would not only change Robert Mitchell's life, it would spark a national conversation about mental health, homelessness, and how we treat the most vulnerable members of our society. Tom leaned forward in his chair, maintaining eye contact with Robert. "I need to tell you something, and I need everyone watching to hear this too." He glanced at the camera, then back to Robert. "Forrest Gump isn't real. He's a character I played. But you know who is real? You are. And your struggle is real. And the courage it took to come here tonight and tell your truth, that's more heroic than anything Forrest ever did." Robert shook his head, trying to protest, but Tom continued. "No, listen to me. Forrest Gump had the benefit of being written by a screenwriter who made sure everything worked out in the end. You're facing real mental illness, real trauma, real challenges that don't get resolved in 2 hours with a happy ending. And you're still here. That's not failure, Robert. That's survival." Tom turned to address the audience and cameras directly. How many of us are watching right now and thinking, "This could never happen to me"? But it could. Mental illness doesn't care about your PhD or your career or how much money you have. It can take anyone down. And when it does, we as a society have to do better than just look away and pretend these people don't exist. The audience began applauding, but Tom held up his hand. "Robert, you said you taught Forrest Gump to your students. Can I tell you what I learned from playing that character? I learned that the most important thing isn't being smart or successful or having everything figured out. It's showing up. It's being present. It's treating people with kindness, especially when the world isn't kind to you." Tom's voice grew stronger. "You showed up tonight. After 17 years of hell, you found the courage to walk into this studio and tell your story. That's showing up, Robert. That's what Forrest would do. That's what a hero does." Robert was crying again, but this time there was something different in his expression. Not just pain, but a flicker of something else. Hope, perhaps. Or recognition. Or simply the profound relief of being seen after years of invisibility. "Where are your wife and daughters now?" Tom asked gently. "I don't know," Robert admitted. "I left them. I thought they'd be better off without me. I don't even know if they're still in New York, or if they—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Tom pulled out his phone. "What are their names?" "Sarah Mitchell. And my daughters were Emma and Claire. But they'd be adults now. They were just little girls when I left." Tom typed something into his phone, then looked up at the audience. "Folks, we're going to find Robert's family. If anyone watching knows Sarah, Emma, or Claire Mitchell who lived in Brooklyn in 2002, please contact NBC. We're going to help Robert reconnect with the people he loves." He turned back to Robert. "But first, we're going to get you help. Real help. Not just a bed for the night, but actual treatment for your mental health. Medical care. Everything you need to get stable. And I'm going to personally make sure that happens." Jimmy Fallon, who had been silent throughout this extraordinary exchange, spoke up. "Tom, NBC will cover all costs. Whatever Robert needs, treatment, housing, everything. We're in." The audience erupted in applause, many people standing, but Tom remained focused on Robert. "Here's what's going to happen tonight," Tom said. "You're not going back to the streets. Ever. I'm taking you to the hospital right now. We're getting you checked out medically. Then we're getting you into a residential treatment program where you can work on your mental health with professionals who understand what you've been through. And while you're getting healthy, we're going to find your family." Robert looked overwhelmed. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why would you do this for me? You don't know me." Tom smiled, and it was the same warm smile that had made him one of America's most beloved actors. Because you taught Forrest Gump to your students. You used something I created to help young people learn. That makes us connected, Robert. Your life mattered then, and it matters now. And I'm not going to let you disappear again. What happened in the next hour was unprecedented in television history. Tom Hanks didn't finish the interview. He didn't wave goodbye to the cameras and head to his hotel. Instead, with Director Diomedes' approval, cameras followed as Tom personally escorted Robert Mitchell out of the studio and into a waiting car that would take them to Mount Sinai Hospital. The Tonight Show cut to reruns, but NBC made the decision to stream the hospital arrival live on their website. Millions watched as Tom Hanks, still in his interview clothes, walked alongside a homeless man into an emergency room and stayed with him as doctors began their assessment. The footage of Robert and Tom in the studio went viral within minutes. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from tears to calls for better mental health support to people sharing their own stories of homelessness and depression. But the most important reaction was happening in a small apartment in Queens, where a woman named Sarah Mitchell was watching The Tonight Show live with her adult daughters. Sarah Mitchell had lived 17 years not knowing if her husband was alive or dead. She had filed missing persons reports. She had searched shelters. She had walked the streets of Manhattan looking at the faces of homeless men, hoping and dreading that she might recognize Robert. Eventually, she had been forced to accept that he was either dead or so lost to his illness that he couldn't find his way back. She had raised Emma and Claire alone, working 2 jobs to make ends meet, always carrying the dual burden of grief and anger. Grief for the man she had loved, anger at him for abandoning them. Emma, now 27, had become a social worker specializing in homeless outreach. Her father's disappearance had shaped her entire career path. Claire, 25, was in medical school studying psychiatry. Both daughters had tried to understand their father's illness intellectually, but emotionally, they struggled with feeling abandoned. On the night of May 14, 2019, Sarah almost didn't watch The Tonight Show. She was tired from a long shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. But Emma had texted her that Tom Hanks was on, and Sarah had always loved his movies. She made herself a cup of tea and turned on the TV just as the final segment was starting. When Robert Mitchell stumbled into the studio, Sarah's teacup fell from her hands and shattered on the floor. She knew immediately, despite the years and the changed appearance, that she was looking at her husband. "Mom?" Emma called from her bedroom, hearing the crash. "Are you okay?" Sarah couldn't speak. She was staring at the screen, watching this moment that seemed impossible. Emma and Claire rushed into the living room and saw what their mother was seeing. "Oh my God," Claire whispered. "That's Dad." The 3 women watched in stunned silence as Tom Hanks spoke to Robert with such compassion and kindness. They cried when Robert explained what had happened to him. And when Tom asked about their names, Sarah, Emma, Claire, Sarah grabbed her phone with trembling hands. Within minutes, she had called NBC's main line and was frantically explaining to anyone who would listen that she was Robert Mitchell's wife. At first, the receptionist thought she was a prank caller. The show had just happened minutes ago, but Sarah's desperation was so genuine that the call was transferred up the chain until it reached a producer who was still in the studio. Tom Hanks took the call personally. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said. "Is he really alive?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "Is it really him?" "He's alive," Tom confirmed, "and he needs you. We're taking him to Mount Sinai Hospital right now. Can you meet us there?" 45 minutes later, in a private room at Mount Sinai Hospital, a reunion took place that would become the emotional conclusion to a story that had captivated millions. Robert was sitting on an examination table, cleaned up slightly by nurses and wearing a hospital gown. He had been given a mild sedative to help calm his anxiety. Tom was sitting in a chair nearby, refusing to leave until Robert was stable. When the door opened and Sarah walked in, followed by Emma and Claire, Robert's face transformed. All the confusion and pain that had marked his features seemed to fall away, replaced by raw recognition and overwhelming emotion. "Sarah," he whispered. She crossed the room quickly and wrapped her arms around him, holding him as he sobbed against her shoulder. "I'm so sorry," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry. I thought you'd be better without me. I'm so sorry." "You idiot," Sarah said, crying just as hard. "We needed you. We always needed you." Emma and Claire joined the embrace. This family that had been broken for 17 years, finally together again. Tom Hanks quietly stood to leave, feeling like an intruder on this private moment. But Robert looked up. "Tom, please stay. You're part of this now." Tom sat back down, tears in his own eyes, as Robert tried to explain to his family what had happened, where he had been, why he had stayed away. The words came haltingly, interrupted by sobs and apologies, but the essential truth emerged. He had been sick, ashamed, and convinced that he was protecting them by staying away. "Dad," Emma said firmly, "I'm a social worker now. I work with homeless people every day. I became a social worker because of you, because I needed to understand what happened to you and help people like you. And I'm in medical school studying psychiatry," Claire added, "because I needed to understand mental illness. You didn't protect us by leaving, Dad. You just gave us a different kind of pain. But we're here now, and we're not leaving you again." The hospital room conversation lasted for over 2 hours. Tom remained present, occasionally offering words of support, but mostly just bearing witness to this family's process of beginning to heal. Dr. Patricia Armstrong, the psychiatrist who had been called in to assess Robert, eventually had to interrupt. "I know this is an emotional reunion, but Robert needs immediate psychiatric care. He's been without treatment for his depression and anxiety for nearly 2 decades. He needs to be admitted to our psychiatric unit for stabilization." Sarah nodded. "How long?" "At least several weeks for initial treatment and assessment. Then we'll transition him to a residential treatment facility where he can receive intensive therapy while learning to manage his conditions. The good news is that with proper medication and therapy, people with Robert's diagnoses can recover and lead full lives. But it's going to be a journey." Tom spoke up. "Whatever he needs, treatment, therapy, medication, housing after he's released, it's covered." "I meant what I said. Robert's not disappearing again." But Sarah shook her head. "Mr. Hanks, we appreciate what you've done more than we can ever express. You found him. You brought him back to us. But my family will take care of his treatment. We've been waiting 17 years for the chance to help him. This is something we need to do." Tom started to protest, but Sarah continued. "However, if you really want to help, there are thousands of people like Robert out there, people with mental illness who have fallen through the cracks, people who don't have families still looking for them. If you could use your platform to help them, to raise awareness about mental health and homelessness, that would honor what you did tonight." Tom nodded slowly. "I can do that. I will do that." And he did. The story of Tom Hanks and Robert Mitchell didn't end in that hospital room. In many ways, it was just beginning. The video of Robert crashing The Tonight Show and Tom's response became one of the most watched clips in late-night television history. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed over 100 million times across various platforms. But more importantly, it started conversations about mental health and homelessness that reached into every corner of American society. Robert spent 6 weeks in Mount Sinai's psychiatric unit, where doctors finally identified the full scope of his conditions: severe depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and symptoms of PTSD from his years on the streets. With proper medication and intensive therapy, the confusion and fragmentation that had plagued him for nearly 2 decades began to clear. "It was like watching someone emerge from underwater," said Dr. Armstrong. As Robert stabilized on medication, the brilliant professor began to resurface. He was still himself. He had just been drowning for a very long time. Sarah, Emma, and Claire visited daily. They attended family therapy sessions where, with professional guidance, they began processing the trauma of his disappearance and their complex feelings of love, anger, and grief. It wasn't easy. There were sessions filled with painful truths and difficult conversations, but they were committed to healing as a family. After his release from the hospital, Robert moved into a transitional living facility that specialized in helping formerly homeless individuals with mental illness rebuild their lives. He continued outpatient therapy and attended support groups for people with depression and anxiety. 6 months after his appearance on The Tonight Show, Robert reached out to Tom Hanks with a request. He wanted to return to teaching. Tom connected Robert with the principal of a public high school in Brooklyn that served primarily low-income students. Many of them had their own experiences with homelessness, mental illness, or family trauma. The principal, Maria Rodriguez, was initially hesitant, but after meeting Robert and hearing his story, she saw an opportunity. These kids need to see that it's possible to fall down completely and still get back up. They need to know that mental illness doesn't define you, and they need a teacher who can meet them where they are because he's been there too. Robert Mitchell returned to teaching in September 2019. His first day back in a classroom after 19 years was emotional and terrifying and beautiful. He taught a unit on resilience in literature, and yes, he included Forrest Gump. But he also included his own story. He was honest with his students about his mental illness, his homelessness, and his long journey back. He told them that asking for help isn't weakness, it's courage. He told them that failure isn't permanent unless you stop trying. And he told them that sometimes the people who understand struggle best are the ones who've survived it. "Mr. Mitchell is the realest teacher I've ever had," said Marcus Johnson, one of his students. "He doesn't pretend like he has everything figured out. He's just honest about his journey, and that makes us feel like we can be honest about ours." Tom Hanks kept his promise to Sarah. He became an outspoken advocate for mental health awareness and homelessness prevention. He partnered with organizations providing services to homeless individuals, particularly those with mental illness. He used his celebrity platform to lobby for increased funding for mental health services. In 2020, Tom Executive produced a documentary called The Invisible Millions about homelessness and mental illness in America. Robert Mitchell was prominently featured, telling his story in depth and explaining how easily anyone can fall through society's safety net. The documentary won an Emmy and, more importantly, influenced policy discussions at the federal level. Several cities implemented new programs based on the documentary's recommendations, providing integrated services that addressed both housing and mental health needs. Tom and Robert developed a genuine friendship. They would meet for coffee occasionally, talking about books, movies, and life. Tom even invited Robert to be a consultant on a future film project about mental health, valuing his authentic perspective. Emma Mitchell's work as a social worker gained new depth after her father's return. She launched a nonprofit organization called Second Chapters that specifically helped formerly homeless individuals with advanced degrees re-enter their professions. Her father's story had shown her that talent and education don't disappear just because someone falls on hard times. "There are thousands of Robert Mitchells out there," Emma explained at the nonprofit's launch event. "People with PhDs, former lawyers, engineers, teachers, all living on the streets because mental illness or addiction or trauma derailed their lives. They don't just need housing, they need pathways back to meaning and purpose." Claire completed her psychiatric residency with a specialization in treating homeless populations. Her doctoral thesis examined the intersection of trauma, homelessness, and family systems. Her father's case became a foundational example in her research, though she always protected his privacy in her academic work. The Mitchell family rebuilt their relationship slowly and honestly. Robert moved into a small apartment in Brooklyn, close enough to Sarah and his daughters, but maintaining his independence as he continued his recovery. He and Sarah eventually reconciled romantically, though they took their time, attending couples therapy and rebuilding trust that had been shattered by his disappearance. "We're not the same people we were in 2002, Sarah reflected in an interview 2 years after Robert's return. "We can't just pick up where we left off. But we can build something new, something stronger because it's built on honesty and understanding rather than hiding our vulnerabilities." Robert became a spokesperson for mental health awareness, speaking at schools, conferences, and community centers about his experience. His message was always the same. Mental illness is not a moral failure. Asking for help is an act of courage, and recovery is possible even after the darkest times. One of his most powerful speeches took place at the Dalton School, where he had once taught. The administration invited him to speak to current students about resilience and mental health. Standing in front of a classroom for the first time in nearly 2 decades at the school where his career had ended, Robert felt the full circle of his journey. "I stood in rooms like this one and taught you about literary heroes," he told the students, "characters who faced impossible challenges and persevered. But I didn't teach you the most important lesson, that real life doesn't follow a story structure. Real heroes don't always win. Sometimes they fall apart completely. And that's okay, because the real story isn't about never falling down. It's about finding the courage to get back up, even when it takes 17 years. The standing ovation he received that day was one of the proudest moments of his second chance at life. The Tonight Show itself was transformed by what happened that night. Jimmy Fallon and the production team started a regular segment called Stories That Matter, where they highlighted individuals doing extraordinary things to help vulnerable populations. They raised millions of dollars for mental health and homelessness organizations. Robert Mitchell changed our show, Fallon said in an interview. He reminded us that we have a platform that can do more than just entertain. We can shine a light on important issues and real people who need to be seen. The security guard who had left his post for those crucial 30 seconds, the gap that allowed Robert to enter the studio, was not fired as many expected. Instead, Tom Hanks personally requested that NBC keep him on staff. Sometimes the universe needs us to be exactly where we are, even if we don't understand why, Tom said. That 30-second gap brought Robert back to his family. Maybe it was meant to happen exactly that way. 3 years after the incident, Robert published a memoir titled Invisible, A Professor's Journey Through Homelessness and Back. The book became a bestseller and was used in university courses on social work, psychology, and urban studies. All proceeds went to mental health organizations serving homeless populations. In the book's acknowledgments, Robert wrote, "To Tom Hanks, who saw me when I was invisible, who listened when I had nothing coherent to say, who proved that true heroism isn't playing a character on screen, it's choosing compassion when it would be easier to look away. You didn't just change my life. You taught me that my life was worth changing." Tom wrote the foreword to Robert's memoir. In it, he reflected on that night at The Tonight Show. "I've played heroes in movies. I've pretended to be brave, noble, selfless. But on May 14th, 2019, I met a real hero. Robert Mitchell showed more courage walking into that studio than any character I've ever portrayed. He showed us all that asking for help, admitting vulnerability, and refusing to give up on yourself, even after years of giving up, is the truest form of heroism." The story also had unexpected ripples in Hollywood. Several actors and directors reached out privately to Tom, sharing their own struggles with mental health or stories of family members who had experienced homelessness. The entertainment industry, long known for its stigma around mental health issues, began having more open conversations about supporting members who were struggling. One director, speaking anonymously, told a reporter, "Watching Tom's response to Robert made me realize I could talk about my own depression and anxiety. If someone as successful as Tom Hanks could show that much vulnerability and compassion, maybe the rest of us could too." 5 years after his return, Robert Mitchell was thriving. He had been promoted to department head at his Brooklyn high school. He had published 2 more books, one an updated anthology of American poetry with commentaries on how literature helps us process difficult emotions, and another, a guide for teachers on supporting students with mental health challenges. His relationship with his daughters had deepened beyond what any of them had imagined possible. Emma often brought clients from her nonprofit to Robert's classroom to show them that rebuilding a career after homelessness was possible. Claire consulted with her father on her psychiatric cases, valuing his lived experience alongside her medical training, and Sarah and Robert remarried in a small ceremony in Central Park, the same park where Robert had slept rough during his years of homelessness. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. The place that had represented his lowest point had become the setting for a new beginning. Tom Hanks attended the wedding, sitting quietly in the back, not wanting to draw attention from the Mitchell family's special day. But during the reception, Robert pulled him aside. "I never properly thanked you," Robert said. "That night on the show, you could have had security remove me. You could have finished your interview and gone back to your hotel. Instead, you stopped everything and listened. Do you have any idea how many lives you changed by making that choice?" Tom smiled, that familiar, warm smile that had made him America's favorite actor. "Robert, you changed your own life. You walked into that studio. You told your truth. All I did was recognize that your story mattered. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Robert said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most people look at someone like I was that night and see a problem to be removed. You saw a person who needed to be heard. That's rare. That's special. That's why you're the kind of person who deserves to play heroes in movies, because you understand that real heroism is about seeing the humanity in people everyone else has stopped seeing. The two men embraced, both understanding that they had been part of something larger than either of them. A moment that had started as a disruption on a late-night talk show had become a movement that was changing how America thought about mental health, homelessness, and second chances. The story of Tom Hanks and Robert Mitchell reminds us of several profound truths that we often forget in our fast-paced, look-away society. First, it shows us that mental illness can happen to anyone. A PhD from Columbia doesn't protect you. A loving family doesn't protect you. Success and intelligence and education don't protect you. Mental illness is a medical condition, not a moral failing, and it deserves the same compassion and treatment as any physical disease. Second, it proves that homelessness isn't always about laziness or poor choices. Sometimes it's about illness, trauma, and a lack of adequate support systems. Behind every person on the street is a story, a history, a family that might be searching for them. They are not invisible. They are human beings who deserve to be seen. Third, it demonstrates the incredible power of simply listening. Tom Hanks didn't have to solve all of Robert's problems in that moment. He just had to be present, to listen, to acknowledge Robert's humanity. That simple act of attention and respect was enough to start a chain of events that would transform not just Robert's life, but countless others. Fourth, it illustrates that recovery is possible even after the darkest times. Robert spent 17 years on the streets, lost in mental illness and despair. Many people would have considered him beyond help. But with proper treatment, family support, and the opportunity to rebuild, he not only recovered, he thrived. He became a better teacher, a better father, a better person because of what he had survived. Finally, it shows us that sometimes the greatest performances happen off-camera. Tom Hanks has won Academy Awards for his acting. He's created memorable characters that will live forever in film history. But his finest moment might have been a spontaneous choice to stop a late-night interview and listen to a homeless man's story. Because in that moment, Tom Hanks reminded us all of what truly matters. Not fame, not success, not maintaining the smooth flow of a television production. What matters is recognizing the inherent worth of every human being, especially those whom society has taught us to ignore. What would you do if someone from the margins of society interrupted your life with a desperate plea to be heard? Would you have the courage to stop what you're doing and truly listen? Would you see past the surface to recognize the person underneath? Robert Mitchell's story challenges us to be more aware, more compassionate, and more willing to help when we encounter people who are struggling. His journey from prestigious professor to homeless man to recovered educator shows us that anyone can fall, but also that anyone can rise again with the right support. Tom Hanks's response reminds us that we all have the power to change someone's life, simply by choosing to see them, to listen to them, to acknowledge their humanity when everyone else looks away. The night a homeless man interrupted The Tonight Show, millions of people expected security to remove a problem. Instead, they witnessed something much more powerful. They saw what compassion looks like in action. They saw a movie star choose humanity over Hollywood. They saw a broken man find his voice after 17 years of silence. And they saw proof that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply stop, listen, and remind someone who has been invisible for far too long that they matter, that their story deserves to be heard, and that it's never too late for a second chapter. If this story moved you, remember that there are millions of Robert Mitchells in our communities, people struggling with mental illness, homelessness, or both, who just need someone to see them and help connect them to resources. Share this story to raise awareness about mental health and homelessness. Like and subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us of our shared humanity. And most importantly, the next time you encounter someone who society has taught you to ignore, remember Robert and Tom. Remember that every person has a story. Every person matters. And sometimes all it takes to change a life is the courage to stop and listen. Until next time, remember, the greatest performances in life happen when we choose compassion over convenience, when we choose to see rather than look away, and when we choose to believe that every human being deserves a second chance.